Welcome to this course, PJS 3217, Conflict Resolution and Management for Governance. My name is Mr. Waso Wakwabubi. Today's lesson, we're going to look at theories of conflict. To begin with, we shall try to define what conflict theory is according to Lewis Closer. And he states that in general, conflict theory seeks to scientifically explain general assumptions about conflict in society, especially how conflicts start and vary. And that is the most important aspect, because theories of conflict are about the origins of conflict in the society. So they try to explain and try to look at the sources of conflicts in the society, but also how conflicts vary from one context to the other. So they try to explain these variances from one context to another, whether it's domestically within a country or even continentally within a region, but also at a global level. But the theories also focus on the effects of conflicts within different societies. So the central concerns of conflict theory are the unequal distribution of scarce resources and power. The fact that in the society, as population grows, the resources become scarce, and therefore many people, they start now scrambling for these resources. And as such, when you look at conflicts, whether it's locally, even continentally and globally, you see that resources and power are the key drivers of conflict. So then the question just becomes explaining what types of resources are we discussing and what types of powers are we discussing, be it political, be it economic, be it even military power. And nowadays, even technological power also becomes an issue. So what these resources might be different for each theorist, as we shall see, but conflict theorists usually work with Weber's three systems of stratification, which includes class, status, and power. So the kinds of theories we're going to look at have been divided into at least 4 categories. First of all, we shall look at the 3 models of conflict theory. This basically gives us the traditional theories of conflict that existed around the time of the industrial era. So basically the Marxist theory that Karl Marx came up with, and then the Personian conflict theory that Ralph Gustavo came up with, and then finally the elite conflict theory that Charles Wright Mills came up with. And then secondly, we shall look at the general theories of conflict. The background of this category of theories is basically looking at the different disciplines within which different theories can be discussed, from sociology to economics, to including psychology, and even including technology. And around those different disciplines, we try to find out how many theories we can actually pull out of these different disciplines. Specifically to mean that when we are discussing theories of conflict, it's a multidisciplinary endeavor. So there's no way out we can just focus on sociology alone. It touches on so many other disciplines, including especially politics as well. So within that category of theories, we shall look at behavioral theories by scholars like Durban and John. And we shall also look at sociological theories by scholars like Eckart and Hans. And we shall look at demographic theories, and under demographic theories, we've got one which we call Malthusian theory by Thomas Robert. And then we've got what we call the youth bulge theory by a scholar called Ghana. And then we shall look at what we call rationalist theories, the ones that have to do with intelligence and reasoning, basically mostly psychological theories that are cognitive in nature. So then we shall look at a scholar like Geoffrey Blaine who has discussed this whole idea of war is a rational endeavor. And then finally, within that category, we look at political science theories, which simply look at politics as a source of conflict and war. And within that category, we look at some traditional political scientists like Niccolo Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes, when they came up with their works, The Prince and the Leviathan, respectively. And then another category within which we shall discuss the theories of conflict, the theories that we call new civil and ethnopolitical theories that help us describe the kinds of causes that lead to conflicts that have happened, especially in the 90s. That is when we were no longer having the traditional wars like the First World War or the Second World War, or even the Cold War that happened from 1945 towards the beginning of towards the beginning of the 1990s. So those are the kinds of wars that we are traditionally today calling conflicts instead of wars, because they are happening within one country. That's why we are calling them civil and ethno-political violence, because they are simply about ethnicity and also about nation formation. So politics within one country and within the borders of one country. So we basically could call them intranational conflicts. So within that, we shall look at ancient hatreds and how those cause conflicts. We shall look at identity politics, and we shall also look at manipulative elites and how they cause conflict. And we shall look at the economic roots of conflicts within one country. And then we shall look at contention for power, when different groups in a country are contending for power, especially in Africa. This could mean different tribes contending for power. And then number 4, we shall look at the roots of conflicts in Africa, as discussed by Ali Mazrui in 2003. Ali Mazrui is actually a Kenyan, and he's one of those prolific scholars, and he's discussed a few causes of conflicts in Africa from his point of view and his own experience as an African. So he looks at black violence and white roots, but especially with a focus on the white roots. And then he looks at the borders we have in Africa and how those lead to conflict. Then he looks at religion or ethnicity. And then he also looks at resources and ethnicity. And then he looks at the modern weapons and the pre-modern armies as a cause of conflict. And he also looks at dualism and pluralism as a cause of conflict. And lastly, he looks at Africa and the whole idea of how many wars we've had in Africa, as in those that are between countries, and how many have just been conflicts, and which ones are even better between a war and a conflict. So moving forward, we start looking into each of those categories of theories briefly, so that then we can get to understand what some of these scholars are saying about the causes of conflicts. So I want to begin by looking at the 3 models of conflict theory, which roughly gives us the Marxist theory of conflict, and the Personian conflict theory, and then finally the elite conflict theory. So I want to begin by Karl Marx and his Marxist theory of conflict. And Karl Marx basically divided the society into 2 classes. And one of those classes was the working class. The working class are those people who work in companies and in factories and in the industries. But then he also discussed what he called the capital class. The capital class are now the owners of those factories and those industries. So he actually said that the capital class are the owners of the resources, are the owners of the power within the society. So his explanation of conflict was that if the working class do not organize and demand for their rights, there's a way in which the capital class, which he calls the bourgeoisie, will make sure that they are exploiting the working class, and the working class will not have their rights. So the capital class could try to do things like making sure there are no weekends for the workers, could make sure that when workers want to go for leave, they cannot go for leave, to make sure that the wages they are paying the workers are not the required wages. So basically they are exploiting the working class. As such, he said that, and in that connection, he says that the government is likely to team up with the capital class so they can exploit the working class. So in that connection, he says the working class has to organize. And this led to some revolutions, like in Russia when we had the Russian revolution in 1918. It was organized around this kind of thinking, so that the workers then have to organize into workers' unions and force the capital class to be able to take care of their needs. So the source of conflict is the capital class, is between the classes in the society. Basically, the capital class trying to exploit the working class, and therefore the working class rising up against the capital class. And that leads to conflict, according to Karl Marx. So Karl Marx is in support of workers' unions as a solution to conflicts in society. And when we come to the Personian conflict theory, so because Ralph wrote a little bit later, after Marx had already written, and so many other things had started happening in the society, including there being more than 3 sectors, in that now we had the government, and we had the capital class, and then we had the working class. But democracy had also started coming up. So within the society, we could also start discussing things like human rights and the rule of law. So the Personian conflict theory tries to focus on the power is not just with one class. The power is not concentrated in one place against the other place. But he discusses the whole idea that there are different groups of people within the society who hold power. And that where conflict comes from is when, like, the government tries to get people to do something, what we call legitimate power. The people have given the government the power, but for the government to get the people to follow a certain thing, to get the public support, that is where then conflict comes in. So that then the government has to make sure that it gets a consensus from the people, so that people cannot be forced to do what they do not want to do. So there's a way in which they can refuse. So that then conflict arises when the government or when the powers that be fail to convince the people to do what they want them to do. So that is the Personian theory. It diversifies power a little bit. It opens it up a little bit so that it's not just between 2 classes and concentrated in one capital class, but he opens it up to place it in different entities within the society, and it discusses the whole idea of consensus. Then conflict is a result of lack of consensus in what the powers that be want to do. So if people refuse to follow, then that is where conflict begins. And then Charles Wright discusses the elite conflict theory, and he actually identifies 2 classes within the society. So he discusses the elites and the masses. And therefore he says that conflict in the society is between the elites and the masses. And he says that the power is concentrated in the elites. And he actually identifies 3 types of elitism, which he is calling the economic elitism, and then there's the military elitism, and then of course there's the political elitism. So he says that when you take these 3 types of elitism, the political, the military, and the economic, and then you concentrate them in a smaller group of people, and these people could end up making the government. So they dominate in decision making. They can make policies, make laws, and then come up with different things for the society. But later on, when the masses look at the decisions that were made, they find out that even if they were asked to participate a little bit, these groups of people, the military, the government, and even the economic elites, did not take care of the needs of the people. So as a result, people then have to organize and try to get the government to include their needs within the policies and the laws that they make. So that is the elite theory. Is about the three forms of elitism and how power is concentrated in that, and how later on that can actually lead to conflict because the masses are not represented. The elites tend to leave them out. Then we can move to the next group of theories that I have called the general theories of conflict. And like I mentioned earlier, these are the ones that are basically based on the different disciplines, to give an impression that when you are analyzing conflict using theories, then you have to make it a multidisciplinary endeavor as opposed to just focusing on one discipline. So the behavioral theories are actually psychological theories, and they try to explain conflict as originating from people internally. So they are actually rooted in the behavior of the people. So some psychologists have argued that human beings are inherently violent, just like animals. This aggressiveness is fueled by displacement and projection, where a person transfers their grievances into bias and hatred against other races, religions, nations, ideologies. So conflict is being discussed as a behavior that actually people do not learn, but a behavior that they are actually born with. So that a human being naturally is aggressive and is violent, that when provoked, they are likely to respond with violence as opposed to responding with wanting to talk and negotiate on whatever thing they are arguing about. So by this theory, the nation state preserves order in the local society while creating an outlet for aggression through warfare. So this theory tends to tell us that the government can try to maintain law and order from within, and if people must fight, then they organize in such a manner that this fight is not within their borders, but they can go and fight with a neighboring country just to be aggressive if they want to express their anger, but that you cannot control people from not fighting. So if war is innate to human nature, as is presupposed and predetermined by many psychological theories, then there is little hope for ever escaping it. And later on, you will see that this becomes more or less like an area of agreement for most scholars and theorists, that war is inevitable. We cannot actually avoid it. And then we quickly look at the sociological theories under the discipline of sociology. And this basically explains the whole idea that conflict is a result of what happens in the society, how people socialize, the economic aspects within the society, the culture of the people, and what people are doing in the society, and how this contradicts with each other. So there are competing beliefs in the society, and as such, different ethnicities within the society and different cultures within the society, and as such, that is likely actually to lead to conflict. So sociology has long been very concerned with the origins of war, and many thousands of theories have been advanced, many of them contradictory to each other. Sociology has thus divided those kinds of beliefs into a number of schools, and one such a school is the primate, the inene politique, primacy of domestic politics, that sees war as a product of domestic conditions, with only the target of aggression being determined by international realities. So that in as much as we have international wars, that the origins of these international wars has got nothing to do with international relations, but has got a lot to do with the internal struggles, social struggles within a society. And then people only reach out to fight other countries so they can express their anger about what is happening within their own countries. So this is just the different cultures, the different ethnicity, and how this determines the sharing of resources within the society is then likely to lead to conflict. And then the demographic theories are basically about statistics, And they are divided into two, such that then we have the Malthusian theory that Malthus came up with. And this theory tries to explain the whole idea that that because of population growth, then we end up with too many people living within the borders of a particular society, and the resources become scarce. When people increase, the resources become scarce, and even as they become scarce, we've got some people then who tend to take more than the others, and as a result, then conflict is as a result of increased population and limited resources, and therefore fighting for those resources. And then the second theory under the demographic theories is the youth bulge theory, which then discusses that in most countries, especially today, the number of the youths can almost make up 75% of the population. And this could be the youths who are between the age of 20 and maybe 25. That's where the majority of the youths are. So this theory tries to explain that when there are too many youths and they are not employed to engage into some constructive employment, then there is a likelihood that those youths then will start engaging into conflict. So that this one is just about the young people in the society, the youth in particular, and lack of enough employment opportunities, and as such, they start engaging into conflict. And then the rationalist theories, from the word rational, simply means that for people to engage into a conflict, they calculate. They look at the kind of conflict they want to engage in, and they figure out what benefits they are going to get from fighting a war, what are some of the consequences they are likely to incur. And once they establish that the consequences are less than the benefits, then they are likely going to engage into that war, so then they can use that war to get to a solution. So war is a rational endeavor, so people calculate. The same way you want to engage into a business, you calculate. You look at the costs, the consequences, and the profit you're likely to make out of it, and therefore you engage in that war. A good example could be in 1978 when Mwalimu Nyerere went to fight with Uganda against Idi Amin Dada, and he knew that he was going to succeed because his army was stronger than the Ugandan army. And then lastly, I discussed the political science theories, which actually are based on the realist approach in international relations. So basically believes that as a country, you have to get your army strong, and your neighbor is always your enemy. So you always have to get prepared to fight with your enemy. So that is it about the politics and looking at the international community as being a community where your neighbor is always your enemy. So you have to armor yourself all the time. And then I quickly look at the theories of new civil and ethno-political violence in Africa. And that includes a theory like the ancient hatred, which believes in the fact that in most communities in Africa, tribes hate each other. So every time there is anything that provokes a fight, they use that hatred to fight each other. And then there is the identity politics, where ethnicity is linked to politics, and different communities identify with political power within a certain society, and every time they are challenged a little bit to give up that power, and then they fight back, and then that becomes a conflict. The manipulative elites theory focuses on the whole idea that the elites provoke the people to engage into conflict. So they can rally the people to engage into conflict, so they can get political mileage from that type of a conflict. And then the economic roots, especially in communities where resources are not distributed equitably, and then not all the people in the country benefit from the revenue that the country generates, then that also leads to conflict. And then the contention for power, simply when different groups within a society are fighting for power, that actually also leads to conflict. Then lastly, I look at the roots of conflict in Africa, according to Ali Mazrui in 2003. And one of those he explains is the black violence and white roots, such that the kinds of violence you see in Africa, most of it has got white roots, in that during the colonial times, there's a way in which these colonial masters were setting up these tribes against each other, and even long when they are gone, we are still fighting in Africa. The violence is black, but the roots of that violence is still white. And then our borders to blame. And he agrees that most Africans do not care so much about borders, but he says that yes, indeed, there have been several conflicts in Africa that have been as a result of borders. And he says that one of them was the Biafra War in Nigeria, because he believes that Nigeria should have been left by the colonial masters as 3 countries as opposed to 1 country. So he looks at the Igbo and the Yoruba and the Hausa, and he says that these people were supposed to be left as 3 different regions, and the fact that they were left together led to a lot of fighting in Nigeria during the late 1960s. And he also mentions the Somali people in Africa. And then he says that they were left scattered in different countries in Africa instead of a map being drawn in a way that they could be left in one country. And their effort to try to unite as one people has led to so many conflicts, because some of them are in Djibouti, some here in Kenya, some in Somalia, some you find them in Ethiopia. So the maps were not drawn properly. But he says that ideally, most Africans do not fight across border, they fight within the borders. Religion or ethnicity, and he said that religion and ethnicity are both causes of conflicts in Africa, and that in Northern Africa, usually they fight because of religion in countries like Algeria, but that in the rest of Africa, including Central and Eastern Africa and Southern Africa, we mostly fight because of ethnicity. And then he discusses the whole idea of modern weapons and pre-modern armies. And he mentions that after independence in Africa, we had pre-modern weapons, but then our armies were actually disciplined, so that even if the weapons were not modern, the armies were disciplined and they rarely went to war. But that today in Africa, we've got what we call modern weapons and pre-modern armies. So we've got lots of coup d'etats, so that then the armies want to topple the government, so they are not disciplined, and that is a cause of conflict. And then he discusses the whole idea of dualism and pluralism, that there are communities in Africa that are dual, which means there are only 2 tribes, like Rwanda, the Hutu and the Tutsi, or like you go to Zimbabwe, the Shona and the Ndebele. But some other communities like here in Kenya, they are pluralistic, so you can have 42 tribes. So he says that in communities that are dual, like Rwanda, when conflicts arise there, they are likely to last longer. And even if they are short term, like in Rwanda, the conflict only lasted for 100 days. And then within 100 days, 600,000 people to 1 million people had been killed. And they were not even using modern weapons, they were just using machetes. So he's discussing that dualistic communities are very dangerous. When conflicts happen there, they cause a lot of harm. And then he discusses war, a curse or a conflict. And he says that in Africa, it's not countries fighting against each other instead. It is communities, tribes fighting one another within one country. And he therefore notes that when there are wars, that wars do not lead to a lot of damage as opposed to civil conflicts. So he's saying he would rather in Africa we had wars, a country like Uganda fighting with a country like Kenya, as opposed to a country like Rwanda within itself. The Hutus are killing almost all the Tutsis. So he says that the fact that we do not have wars in Africa, we need to look at it whether it's a curse or actually a blessing. And his point is that we would rather have wars where 2 countries fight each other, because that war will be short term, and then the consequences and the harm will not be that big. Yeah. And then just to sum up, then the conflict theory in a manner tends to tell us that all societies have underlying conflicts between social groups, that it's obvious in each society that change is as a result of such conflicts being played out. So means that conflict is inevitable, whether you like it or not, it will happen. that conflict between the classes determines social change, that conflicts sometimes are good for social change, that power goes to the winning group in the conflict, therefore the competition goes on and leads to conflicts which could be violent or non-violent, that social consensus is an illusion, conflict is inevitable, so that then we can look at that narrowly within one country and one region, but also globally, that this is the case as well. So that is the end of our lesson. Thank you so much.
These televised lectures supplement our robust online learning going on our MKU online platform. You can view more on our televised lectures via our online platform. We are in a digital era, and Mount Kenya University knows this. The following are the steps to follow so as to complete your online application. Download the application form from the website www.mku.ac.ke. Attach copies of your academic certificates and ID. Pay the application fees via M-Pesa pay bill number 270988. Your ID is the account number. 2,000 shillings is the charge for a postgraduate. You can also deposit in the bank accounts provided on the website. Then email all the above to apply@mku.ac.ke.